Welcome to VCR, Vintage Cinema Rewind. We're bringing old movies to new viewers. I'm Blake.
Okay, campers, rise and shine, and don't forget your booties, because it's cold out there today.
You certainly have a face for radio, Michael.
Thank you. I do now.
We're doing Groundhog Day, the classic from 1993, a Bill Murray specialty, the Murricane. Not here in person, but here in spirit.
Unfortunately not, no. Although given Bill Murray's tendency to just show up in the randomest of places, who knows what could happen in the next hour.
True.
Maybe he'll knock on my door asking to borrow a cup of sugar and he'll just come on for the rest of the podcast.
I promise absolutely nothing on that, and I hope you're still not disappointed.
Yeah, exactly. What a great quote. I should start starting all my lessons with that. I promise absolutely nothing, and I hope you're not disappointed.
This is our spoiler full discussion of Groundhog Day. If you haven't seen this movie before, highly recommend going back a week and checking out the Groundhog Day primer episode where we go into, a little plot summary, talk who this movie's for, all that fun stuff, talk a little bit about Bill Murray, the man, the myth, the legend, and where you can check this one out. Otherwise, this is, again, our spoiler-full discussion, so we're just about to just dive right into it.
We're not pulling any punches. We're going right down the rabbit hole, or the groundhog hole, as I should say. Blake, edit this out.
I was going to say we're driving right down the train tracks in a car with no care in the world.
Yes, exactly. And with an extra who looks suspiciously like Tim Dillon.
You're actually not wrong. Actually, I couldn't think of where I'd seen him before, and that's it. He just looks like a cross between Tim Dillon and Chris Farley.
There's an extra in a couple scenes of this movie. He looks just like Tim Dillon, Joe Rogan's little buddy. Anyways, it was very distracting.
Yeah, I was not expecting us to start with an extra doppelganger today in this conversation, but here we are.
Well, before we started recording, you said, are you prepared to talk about this? And I said, yes. So I'm giving you what you wanted.
Well, let's start in front of the camera and work our way back. Where do you want to start with Groundhog Day? Chronological order, one day at a time, the rest of your life?
I see indeed what you are doing there. I don't know. I mean, this movie's so interesting. Again, like you said last week, the whole idea of a time loop has become sort of a mini genre in and of itself at this point. But this was a very wild premise for a movie when it came out.
Yeah, definitely. There was some short stories that kind of played with this idea. There was some stories back in the early 1900s. What this is essentially based on as well, what the writer thought of when he was writing about this was a vampire novel, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and how, what it would be like to live forever kind of thing. And that's kind of where all of this is born out of.
Yeah, I think Danny Rubin, right? The co-writer? Yes. Yeah, that's interesting. Wasn't his whole idea that, if you could live forever, you would eventually become a good person by accident? Because you've had all this time to figure it out? Or, wasn't his whole thing, he's like, your average person can't figure out all their own bullshit in 100 years. So you'd probably need 10,000 years to get it all figured out.
Well, and that actually is an interesting conversation in and of itself, right? There's a lot of mystery around the time loop in Groundhog Day, right? Why is this happening? How long has it occurred for? All of this stuff doesn't really get answered in the movie, and personally, I think that that's actually a very wise choice for the story that this film is trying to tell.
I remember Danny Rubin talking about how he wanted to have a sequence where, it was something like Phil would read a book in a page every day, and that would be how he would mark the passage of time in this time loop, right?
Right.
But the studio actually was like, no, that's a bad idea. Don't do that. I forget what their reasoning for that for, but I do actually think the studio was right on that one, because it could have been 5 years, it could have been 10 years, it could have been 10,000 years.
Right.
We have no idea how long he's been in there for.
Well, and each person has a different theory, right? Each of the writer, the director, Bill Murray, each of them kind of has their own theory to how long Phil spends in the time loop. I don't know about you, where you maybe sit on that argument. For me, I kind of subscribe to the 30 to 40 year time range because, we do see Phil learning some really technical, complicated skills throughout the movie, right?
He gets really good at a lot of things,
Yeah.
like ice sculpting, piano, like all that stuff. And like, if you subscribe to the whole like Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours theory, then like he probably spent like close to 10 years getting really, really good at all those things.
Right. And even like something like early on in the film where we see Phil stealing a bag of money out of the bank truck, right?
Mm-hmm.
That would probably take, I don't know, weeks, like at least several weeks for him to memorize and learn every single second of how to steal that perfectly, right?
And there's that scene with Rita later on where he's trying to convince her that he's lived this whole day over and over again. And they're in a restaurant and he's just like, okay, like in about 10 seconds, Larry's going to come in and say this. Like in about 5 seconds, that waiter is going to drop a tray. And then like he's walking around the restaurant and he's introducing her to all these people and like sharing all these deep, complicated theory. Like he's sharing all these like really deep information about all of them. And it's like, I don't care how good your memory is. You've been doing this for a while.
Yeah, definitely. And that comes about to like part of my favorite conversation about, what I talked about last week as the episode that I would sell this movie on is the Phil's a God conversation, where he's like, maybe God isn't just like this omnipotous like presence. Maybe he's just been around so long that he knows everything. Yeah. And that's such a fun idea. And I really love when movies that don't offer explanations at least offer ideas and interesting like thoughts to think about, right?
Yeah, and I mean, like, it's funny, like, you and I watched Edge of Tomorrow over the summer, and they provided an explanation for the time loop, which I thought was interesting. This movie very wisely just throws up its hands and has no idea, right? Like,
Right.
even the whole idea of, like, a groundhog sees a shadow, and, like, then there's 6 more weeks of winter. Like, you can tie some, like, loose thematic threads to that and Phil's situation, but, like, very, very loosely. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. And I agree with you that I think it's a really good decision. And, there's not even little kernels of an idea thrown throughout. Like, it's not like the film's even just trying to like subtly tell you maybe what happened or why this is happening. And again, I think that's a really strong decision for the story that this particular time loop movie is trying to tell.
Yeah, it's just it's more about Phil and his character arc through this time loop. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
It's almost like it is a very spiritual movie in that he's almost in like purgatory or something and he has to unfuck his way out of purgatory.
I will say though, to counter all of this, the best fan theory that I read while I was doing my research was, I think it was in like a YouTuber comment or something like that, but it was a theory that Ned, the insurance guy, has created the time loop and is basically selling insurance to people using and manipulating them through the time loop. And the best supporting argument for that was that basically like it takes until the final loop for us to see Phil buy every single insurance possible.
Wow. You know what? I stand corrected. That's my new favorite. That's my headcanon too.
Yeah.
Ned Ryerson?
Whatever you're doing later, cancel it.
Oh my God. Yeah. He's just like, I gotta go. It's really funny. Although I will say, and we talked about this last week too, like it is shockingly satisfying seeing Phil become a good person. One of my favorite moments is when he's in, like, I guess you could call it the final loop, although even that's ambiguous. He's just walking down the street. He checks his watch. He's like, oh, crap. And he just books it down the street and he catches a kid falling from the tree. And he's just like, you have never once thanked me. And then he's like, all right, I'll see you tomorrow. Like,
maybe.
Yeah.
Well, and actually, maybe that's a good spot to frame this conversation a little bit, is the evolution of Phil as a character throughout this film. And I even want to frame it in the idea of the 5 stages of grief, because that's
Mm-hmm.
actually something that Harold Ramis and
Bill Murray?
Rubin,
Oh, Danny Rubin. Yeah.
Danny Rubin, yeah, though it's kind of what those two in their discussions of maybe where this film eventually the script eventually would land is how they would navigate Phil through this situation and get him from what we see in the opening scenes as like a deeply narcissistic, miserable human being into
Just the
somebody,
worst.
yeah, into somebody that we genuinely care about. We want to succeed, and everybody else wants to see him succeed. Wants to be in his presence.
I know. He is like the man. He is the big man on campus at the end. You know, when like Rita and Larry go into the I don't know, like the town dance or something. He's just up there playing the piano, having a good time. You know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and like everybody in town knows him. And when you think about that, and think about how that final day would have to go for him to have such wide recognition throughout the town, like it's not like anybody else is experiencing this time loop or even has like any sort of deja vu. Like there isn't a lot of hint towards people having any sort of memory or idea that this is happening over and over again.
No, it's completely
Yeah, so everybody has to kind of come around on this guy in only a few short hours, right?
pretty much. But you got to hand it to Phil. He completely nails it. You know, there's that great moment where what's his name, General Zod.
Yes, Michael Shannon.
Michael Shannon and his wife, they come up to it. It's like, and like his wife had been having second thoughts about marrying him, and Bill Murray's like, "Oh, I just needed to fan the flames of her love for you." And then he reaches into his suit pocket. He's like, "Check it out, WrestleMania tickets." And then it's just like, wow, like,
and like even on something like the WrestleMania tickets, if you think about like the deeper idea of that, like he would have had to find somebody very specifically in town to acquire those tickets from, right? Like this is pre-internet too, even.
you almost get the sense that Phil is spending every single day running the exact same quest over and over and over again, and he's so good at it by this point.
Yeah.
That actually, there is something I wanted to bring up. So when I first saw this movie, you know how there's that whole thing with like the homeless man?
Right. Yeah, and actually that's probably my favorite sequence of the movie is Phil's immortality kind of contrasted with the mortality of the people around him, and the fact that like he can't change the future, he can't change what's going to happen. Like ultimately they're even in this one day and having like this ultimate power, basically there are some things that are meant to happen.
Yeah, so the whole premise is there's this old guy this old homeless man who Phil keeps walking past throughout the movie. At one point, like he very snarkily tells him, he's like, "Hey, I'll get you tomorrow." He finally, at one point, tries to do something nice for him, but the guy ends up getting sick and dying. And then Phil runs through a few other groups trying to save the guy, and he just realizes that no matter what he does, the guy is just gonna die, right?
Yeah.
So then he just resolves to be as nice to the guy as possible on his final day. And when I first saw this movie in 2020, I thought that whole sequence probably could have been cut. Like, I didn't think it added much to the movie. But on rewatch this week, I realized that, like, no, you absolutely can't cut that sequence because by this point in the movie, Phil has kind of started coming around and kind of stopped being such a prick. But
Right.
like, it's almost like the story of the Buddha, how like he was sequestered in this palace all his life, and then he took 3 trips out of the palace, and he saw like a sick man, like an old man, and like a man who'd been dismembered in war, and that showed him the reality of suffering. I almost felt like this was kind of a similar thing with Phil, where you're right, like by this point he's kind of started to come around, but now he's starting to, I feel like that whole experience teaches him to value the lives of the people around him a lot more. And that's kind of when he starts spending every loop trying to be as nice as possible.
He starts to pick up on the struggles of the people around him, right? Like there's like you said, when he saves the boy from falling, and I believe if you actually rewatch the scene where he's in the hospital talking to the nurse about the old man and whether or not he's going to live or not, the boy is actually in the hospital with a broken leg at that point in time.
Oh, okay, yeah.
The other stuff that happens, like the mayor choking on his dinner.
Steak, yeah.
Yeah, like
what does
stuff
Phil
like
say
that.
to him at the end? He's like, he was trying to swallow a whole cow.
Yeah, and stuff like that, right? Like, where I think that hospital scene is not only in the build up with him and the old man is important in a sense of like where Phil is going in this story, but it also kind of in a sense explains how Phil in some sense can learn about everything going on, right? And the impact of seeing these people in a hospital, I think also is part of the profound impact on him, and the struggles of these individuals.
And I think it's really powerful and kind of understated. Like, for all Phil knows, he's going to live out this day for the rest of eternity. And yet he's, for all he knows, like, he's going to wake up tomorrow and it's still going to be February 2nd. But, like, he's still going out of his way to protect all these people, despite, you know, the fact that there may be no consequences.
That's actually a really good point as well, the idea of no consequences. And I actually do kind of, you know, we're talking about the latter half of Phil's development, but I do kind of want to go back and talk about early through mid Groundhog Day Phil.
Yeah, sure.
Because, you know, the Phil that we meet pre Groundhog Day is an absolutely miserable person. And he's almost living in like the misery of his own making, right? Like he despises everybody around him and everything around him. Like he's working at this local news station and he's like, you know, telling people right in the opening scene that he's better than them, that he's going to be heading off to some like national TV station any day now, essentially. Like somebody's going to pick him up.
Yeah, he's kind of like a douchebag local celebrity who thinks he's, you know, bigger than he is.
But even under that as well, I think that there's like this deep South loathing that while he's projecting this out, I think he despises the fact that he is here in this spot himself and he can't seem to get out of it. And so, like, while he's projecting this out, I think that there's a lot of inward self-loathing there.
Well, there's that great conversation he has with Rita later on where she says, like, I could never be with someone as conceited as you. And he says something like, conceited? I don't even like myself.
Yeah. and that's really accurate to Phil as I understand him in the beginning of this movie.
Yeah, absolutely, right? I do think this movie has a very strong middle where, like, we see him kind of adjusting to the time loop. And, like, there is kind of that fun sequence with Tim Dillon where he realizes, like, oh, hey, like, I can do whatever I want with no consequences, right?
Right. Well, and that, again, I'm going to kind of tie this to that 5 stages of grief idea. Like, there's the denial in the first probably 2 loops that he goes through where he's like, this can't be happening. I just had a weird dream last night about this day already. And then the second one where he's like, oh my God, I can't, like, this can't be happening. And then there's the anger with the situation and really the bargaining part of like, I can do whatever I want now in this scenario and there's no consequences to this. Like, so if I'm being put in this situation, I'm going to take advantage of it. And I actually think that the scene with the 2 drunk guys and Tim Dillon, as you put it, in the bowling alley and then the subsequent car chase scene, I actually think that's one of the better scenes of the entire movie. I was actually kind of surprised that that wasn't one of the movie clip scenes that we were given an opportunity to like recommend in the primer episode.
Yeah, really. I mean, oh, by the way, I think one of my favorite lines in the whole movie is when he's talking to those 2 like working class dudes at the bowling alley and they're all drinking. And Phil just says something to the effect of like, what if every day was the same and you never went anywhere and nothing you did mattered? And the one guy's just like, well, you just summed me up, all right.
Yeah, exactly. And like that's part of the reason why I love that scene so much is that Phil is, you know, so in his own head that he can't even fathom anybody else having any sort of connection to him in that sense. But it also, in a way, ties the bigger message, the more like, you know, surreal fantasy element of this to our everyday lives as viewers as well, right?
Yeah, because newsflash, boys and girls, life can get pretty repetitive sometimes.
It certainly can be like monotonous. Monotonous.
Yeah.
There it is.
What Blake said.
Yeah, it certainly can be monotonous. Oh my
Sometimes
god.
you shave your head just to break the monotony.
Or sometimes you grow your hair out long for like a year during COVID.
Also that.
You and I just going through midlife crises through our hair. That's fine.
Yeah, you can always tell how me and Blake are doing based on what's going on with our hair.
It's so true. But no, like, yeah, I think that scene, not only is it hilarious, and like that's the first like truly funny scene of this film. Like there's some funny moments, but I think that's like the first scene that I really start to get more into the film is like, okay, we've gotten through the buildup of who this miserable person is. We understand the basic premise of not only the time loop, but also the town of Punxsutawney itself and the day and the basics of the basic structure of the town and the townsfolk's day that he's stuck in.
Well, I like that, like, he just decides to have fun for a little bit, you know? Like, he seduces this woman by pretending to be, like, you know, a high school sweetheart or something.
Yeah.
And then, you know, he steals a bunch of crap from, like, an armored car and, like, you know, all this stuff. And, like, it kind of does make you kind of be like, yeah, like, what if I could just... It's like that Rick and Morty episode where he has, like, the pause or, like, the save feature from a video game. It's like, what if I could just do whatever I wanted with no consequences? You know what I mean?
Right. And, you know, you could even compare that to something like a video game like Grand Theft Auto, right? Where you're given the opportunity to be a complete degenerate. And sometimes that's really fun.
Sometimes we all just want to be complete degenerates with no consequences.
Right. But on the flip side, like, I thought that maybe, like, the one spot, we didn't really talk about this in the primer, that, you know, post Me Too era, I think that, you know, some of that definitely doesn't quite hold up as well, right?
No, and then, well, that leads to the next thing where he tries seducing Rita, right? And...
What a very bizarre sequence of the movie, because I was really conflicted watching that scene, actually, because I found that even like when Phil isn't being honest to Rita in those scenes, like he's trying to manipulate the situation, I still like him enough that I want him to succeed.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, but on the flip side, you can still see, and this is in part, I think, credit to the screenplay, but also in part to Bill Murray's portrayal of Phil, that the performance in this, you can tell the insincerity that Phil has, while also Phil, in this loop multiple times, really truly learning how to manipulate people and making it believable. So, like, as an audience, I can see through it, but I also can understand how he's able to manipulate people so well.
Yeah, well, there's that great moment when he goes up to Rita at the bar and he's like, oh, let's get a drink. And then she says her favorite drink. I forget what it was, like a Long Island iced tea or something. And he's just like, Long Island iced tea, noted. We smash cut to like the next night, the next loop. And he's just like, oh, I'll have a Long Island iced tea. And she's like, oh, that's my favorite. He's like, oh, it's mine too. And then like... he finds out she likes French poetry, so he starts learning French poetry. You know what I mean?
Right.
I found it kind of interesting because, like, he's absolutely being a manipulative jackass, and, like, that scene in the bed and breakfast is really creepy and uncomfortable.
Right.
But, like, in the process of trying to sleep with Rita, he's kind of becoming a more expansive person, and he's also... my theory is that, like... in the process of learning all these things about her to trying to get her pants, he actually is starting to like genuinely fall for her.
Right. And also it's not like he ever succeeds either with her. And, you know, you could argue that maybe with his high school sweetheart there, that it's like a little bit more sinister. But with Rita can cut through the bullshit, you know?
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter.
She sees him for exactly who he is.
Yeah, and it doesn't matter how many times Phil tries and how many times Phil slightly alters the situation. his true self shines through.
There's that great sequence where like they're having their like, I guess you could call it their first date, their romantic night. And it seems like he's actually genuinely enjoying himself. And then she rejects him. And then we see him trying it again, but he's it's like he's very clearly going through the motions. Like he's talking too fast. He's being like too aggressive and like all this stuff. And like he's trying to cross items off a list. And Rita's just looking at him like, ugh. Like,
yeah, well, and she like literally starts to think that he's a stalker at this point too, right?
Yeah, exactly. She's like, did you call all my friends and like tell them, like get all this information about me? Like, this is weird, right?
Right.
Yeah, I know. It's really interesting. And then like I did also really like that scene at the diner where he's grilling her for information. He's like, oh, what does your ideal man look like? And she's like, oh, you know, she says something like he's got a great body, but like he doesn't flaunt it. And Phil's like, oh, sometimes I go months without looking.
Yeah, that was a very close scene for me to almost sell the movie with. Like, it's probably one of the funnier scenes of the movie. Again, it's Bill Murray at his best. Like, it's Bill Murray's sarcastic humor really shining through.
Yeah, yeah. And then there's, again, that moment where she's like, he's sweet and sensitive and isn't afraid to cry in front of me. And he's like, we are talking about a guy, right?
Well, that's exactly it, right? Like, Phil can only fake being what Rita wants for so long. Like, even in that conversation, there's a point in time in which Phil just cannot continue to keep the act up of being like a, you know, lovable goofball. Like,
he can't help but be himself.
Yeah, he really can't.
And then after he gets rejected by Rita too many times, that's when he goes into like his depressive spiral.
Right.
Where he just, there's that great slap montage where she just keeps slapping him over and over again, which he deserves rightfully. And then I like him just like slumming around the bed and breakfast in his pajamas, like drinking Jack Daniels from the bottle. And like he's calling out all the Jeopardy answers before like they even finish the question.
Right. That's probably like, you know, obviously that's the darkest part of the movie as well, because, you know, he kills himself. What we only see him kill himself a few times, like
yeah. By the way, if you want to know how wild this movie was, there's an unaliving montage.
Yeah,
and it's kind of funny.
Well, even the scene with like him stealing the groundhog is kind of like one of the more wild scenes of the entire movie, and one of the most dangerous scenes of the movie for Bill. Like he got bit by the groundhog, because that actually was the groundhog sitting on his lap. Fun fact.
Bill Murray got bitten by it like what, twice?
Yeah, and had to go get like all those fun shots and everything afterwards. So Bill Murray, part of it himself is himself being miserable during the shooting of this. Part of it's probably justified, honestly.
Yeah, I don't want to hang out with a groundhog on my lap, but it is kind of funny though. Like by this point, he's presumably spent years in the time loop. He's realized he can never have Rita, so he just decides he's going to kidnap the groundhog, right?
Right.
It almost kind of makes sense. You're just like, he's desperate. He doesn't know what else to do. He's like, I'm going to steal the groundhog. It's the groundhog's fault.
And I think as well, this is like early on in the film, this was something that I was starting to think about. Like the writing of putting Phil in this situation, Punxsutawney Phil, him sharing his name with the groundhog, but also sharing to a degree his career with the groundhog.
Right.
And the groundhog being even more loved by the town and everyone around him. Like, there's something deeply bittering about that, right?
Yeah, being upstaged by an animal.
Yeah. And it's something that early stage Phil, I don't think could ever deal with. Like, I don't think he could ever come to accept that until later in the film.
Yeah.
Because it's fair. Like, I mean, I get it sometimes, you know.
If you were just like, we're replacing you, Michael, with a groundhog who's also named Michael, I would be like, what? I would probably shoot that groundhog.
Well, when we're cutting costs on the podcast, it's now an option.
Okay, well, I'll kidnap it and drive it into the city dump or something.
Yeah, there's no revenues. It's only cost here at VCR.
Woo!
But I think, you know, like all of this kind of leads to the acceptance part of this, and we've kind of already talked about Phil and him finally starting to genuinely become a better person through those acts of kindness towards the townspeople, that we see Phil start to become better himself. And he also like genuinely starts to take an interest in himself as well, right? Like,
yeah,
we see him learn to master the art of playing piano. We
yeah,
see
and
him.
that's one of my favorite moments. Is he's just chilling at a bar by himself reading a book. He hears someone playing the piano, and he's like, and then he goes and gets piano lessons. Like, it's just like, yeah, cool, whatever. Like, he's not trying to impress Rita. He's not trying to sleep with anyone. He's just like, I should learn how to play the piano.
Yeah, and then, likewise with the ice sculpturing, and there's a few other kind of things that he benefits himself. Like, he to a degree, he also learns how to get better at his job as well, right? Like, we see him give the speech of a lifetime during the Groundhog Day.
Yeah, and he mentions Chekhov, like an old-timey classic Russian author. So you're like, oh, he's also reading books, like,
Yeah. He's doing what eventually I think anybody in a time loop would do. And I think as well, like, I could even probably connect this a little bit to my own life. Once you start to get into the swing of things and get to understanding life a little bit and what your place in life is, then you start to fill yourself full of all of these hobbies and things that make you happy.
Yeah, and I mean, like, you've got infinite time. What else are you gonna do? You're eventually gonna get so bored that you're gonna try something.
Right, yeah, exactly. It's good that you mentioned too that, like, again, this is strictly for himself. Like, in this sequence, we barely even see Rita unless she's just happens to be in the scene.
Mm-hmm.
For like character purposes.
Yeah.
Continuity purposes.
One thing though I do love, and other people point this out, is that even when Phil becomes a better person, he's still kind of a sarcastic dick. You know what I mean? Like, there's that great moment when he's having his piano lessons, and by then he's gotten pretty good, but this woman still thinks it's his first time. She's like, you did say this is your first lesson, right? And he's just like, oh, well, my dad was a piano mover, so maybe it...
Yeah, and, like, I think, again, like, the core personality, the core of who you are as a person doesn't necessarily change, but I think Phil just learns how to appreciate what's around him and be a better person, right?
And I think it all comes back to, he has that very romantic night with Rita where, like, he convinces her to stay with him, but, like, he's not trying to sleep with her. He doesn't want anything from her. She's just talking. Like, he's convinced her about this time loop and that, she's decided she's going to stay with him until it resets, quote unquote.
Yeah.
She kind of encourages him to think of it more as a blessing. Like, think of all the stuff you can do with all this time, right? And she falls asleep, and he has that very kind of touching moment where he essentially admits that he's in love with her and that he's always been in love with her and that she's like the kindest, sweetest, most generous person he's ever met.
Which is accurate because Andy McDowell is all of those things and more.
Yes, absolutely. He has phenomenal taste, right?
Yeah.
And he also kind of admits that he was in love with her from the moment he saw her, and it kind of implies he was just kind of intimidated by her this whole time. And I think this is a credit to both the screenplay and Bill Murray's acting ability, is like, by the end of the movie, you kind of get the sense that he's just okay with this.
Yeah,
like, he
does learn to accept, like, where he is and what he's doing.
Yeah, he's just living up the same day over and over again, and he's just making the most of every single day. Like, we should all be so grateful and so lucky.
Yeah, no, and I think that really is the deeper message of the film, in a sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about Ned Ryerson a little bit and his portrayal.
The Time Lord, yeah.
The Time Lord himself. I'm very conflicted about the Ned Ryerson scenes.
Okay, go on.
I find Ned maybe too annoying in 2024.
Really? What's annoying about him specifically in 2024?
I don't know. It almost feels like too much. Like, It's almost like I just want Bill Murray to just shut him down, kind of.
Well, there's
always.
that great one, like there's that great blue where he just straight up punches him in the face and keeps walking.
Right. And I think that it's a really great portrayal, and there is some good moments out of it, but for me, I guess this comes down to as well, like, what do you care most about Groundhog Day? And for me, I actually care more about the deep philosophical stuff and more than I do the comedy. And what's really interesting about even saying that is it almost puts you on the side of, do you side more with Harold Ramis's take of this film, or do you side more with Bill Murray's take of this film?
If you're asking me, I definitely subscribe to the Ramis take, Like,
right.
Bill's interpretation would have been much, much more bitter and somber.
Right.
Those are two very, very different movies, and I think we got the correct one. You know what I mean?
Right.
This movie is heartwarming, but it's still, like, it's not exactly a saccharine movie. Like, it's still... No one's going to accuse this movie of being too sweet or anything. You know what I mean?
I don't know. I just... And this is a little bit like, dancing on a few different other spots that we'd be talking about, but I really like the core heart of this story. And while I enjoy the comedy and I love Bill Murray's portrayal in this film, I personally am significantly more fascinated with the redemption arc of Phil than I am with the comedic story of Phil's journey.
I kind of see what you mean. Are you saying you would have preferred less zany comedy and more introspection?
I don't know. I think for me, it just like the Ned scenes, are a little too zany for me.
Do you just really want to punch Ned Ryerson? Is that what you're doing?
He's just like, and it's funny because I know that there are people out there like that, and there's people probably from high school that I probably wouldn't want to catch up with myself, like Bill Murray in this scene.
Yeah.
And I know that I'm that person probably for many people as well.
I didn't want to come right out and say it, but no, is it just that Ned's just too annoying? Like, he's very deliberately annoying, but is he just too annoying for Blake?
He might be.
Well, and I think I mentioned this in last week's episode, like, it's funny, you kind of do side with Bill Murray in the first act because everyone in Punxsutawney, did I say that right?
Punxsutawney,
whatever. Everybody is outrageously small town friendly at first, right? Mm-hmm. So you kind of inadvertently side with Bill Murray because you're like, ugh, look at these freaking hicks, right?
Right.
But then, is it maybe that like the other small town characters maybe acquire more depth, or like you just kind of get used to them, whereas Ned is always just very annoying? Is that part of what's bothering you?
That could be it potentially, and maybe it's also like the way that he is framed as well. Like you said as well, the other characters get more depth to them. Like you learn their backstories,
or you at least just get accustomed to them, and they're not as outrageously annoying as Ned is.
Yeah, I'm not sure. That's a good point. I'd have to think about that.
I don't have a problem with Ned per se. I kind of enjoy some of his scenes, but
I think the last conversation with him is great.
Oh, yeah, where he just buys all the insurance.
Right.
So Ned is like, finally lifting the curse from him.
Right. And he's still even like asking like inappropriate questions.
He's like, where are we going?
Yeah.
Yeah. But then Rita kind of shuts him down and he's just like, oh, okay. Like he gets it. And he just leaves him alone. So
right.
I don't know. Fun fact, we talked about how Dan Harmon wanted Bill Murray to play Jeff Winger's father on Community.
Right.
The actor who plays Ned Ryerson was a guest spot in the second season, I think.
Yeah, you know what? Now that you say that, I do kind of remember
there's
him.
There's that episode where Abed is taking a class about Who's the Boss, the 80s sitcom, and the professor has written a book about who the real boss is. And him and Abed causes him to have a mental breakdown. Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe it's because of the fact that I'm also somewhat of an introverted person, that's just somebody that is way too much in my space.
Oh, yeah. And he's the worst, right? Because, like, he's got all this energy. He's way in your space. And then he's trying to sell you something. That is really obnoxious.
Yeah.
In a lot of stories, a pretty girl gets treated as like a prize that the hero has to win. Like the movie often frames pretty girls' love interests as like trophies that the hero gets to win just by virtue of being a bad enough dude or something. But like this is one of those cases where like I don't feel like that was unearned, or at least I don't feel like that was the I feel like Rita is not explicitly framed that way. You know, like yes, she's a very beautiful woman, but like by the end of the movie, Phil has become such a decent person. She's the one pursuing him. Right?
Yeah, right. Like he because he definitely gives up, and we see him give up on trying to pursue that.
Yeah, so hey, to all the young men listening, if there's a pretty girl that you like, don't pursue and just become the best version of yourself, and maybe she'll pursue you.
Or maybe you'll find someone even better.
Right.
Wah, wah, wah. Life stories on VCR. Or life lessons on VCR.
Exactly. But you might have to win over an entire small town in the process in order to get her attention.
Yeah. So let's talk effects and filming then. I think, want to start with the actual script of Groundhog Day and the story of how this came to be, because I think that this is probably the most well-documented start-to-finish film in one of the more documented start-to-finish films in modern history. It's certainly the most documented comedy that I'm aware of, apart from maybe like
I mean, what's
Room.
his face? Dan Rubin has been very open about the writing process behind this movie.
Yeah.
He's almost made like a whole second career out of it.
Yeah, certainly. And Danny Rubin is known primarily for Groundhog Day and never quite achieved anything on the same magnitude. And, you know, probably most people who start with something this impactful rarely ever do, right?
Yeah, let that be another lesson to you kids. If you're going to do something amazing, make sure you retire right after.
It's hard. It's hard chasing perfection.
It's hard to hit the zeitgeist twice. It's hard enough to hit it once.
Yeah. Probably the Matrix movies are the best example of that. But
oh God, yes.
Even though I love the series as a whole, I will admit that the first movie is miles above and so much more culturally impactful than the rest of the series.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
But anyway, Groundhog Day, Danny Rubin. The first draft of this was based on the novel The Vampire Lestat.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about how it comes out of the conception of like immortality and how you would spend your time, how you might change as a person over that time. And that's actually, he kind of combined that with a previous idea that he had thought about waking up and living the same day over and over again. And then the final component of this is trying to, and this is probably a good writing decision in terms of making a lasting impact on culture, trying to wrap this all into a holiday and coming up with the idea of maybe even a lesser known holiday that's still, you know, this movie came out in 1993, so this movie has been out for our literal entire lives. So we don't know, you and I don't know what the impact of Groundhog Day was prior to this, but it's certainly something that you see televised and reported on an annual basis.
Yeah, absolutely, right?
So whether or not this movie created that impact or this movie capitalized on that holiday itself, I guess I don't actually know the answer to that.
I don't really know either. I mean, you don't hear much about Groundhog Day, do you?
Yeah, I think it's brought up like on a regular basis in most media, like traditional media platforms.
Maybe we need to watch more local news.
I don't know about that. Maybe we need to keep local news alive. That's something that I hear.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I technically work in local news, and I have mixed feelings about it.
But I think that originally with the script, like, and if you go into the details of this, the original script idea is so much more complicated than eventually what we got here, right?
Yeah, I think I was reading today that like they were going to explain the time loop as like Phil's ex-girlfriend putting a curse on him,
Right.
And they very wisely cut that, because that would have been fucking stupid.
Well, that's something I think that the studio wanted, right? Is they wanted an explanation because, we can't. And this is maybe something that I've talked about before, is ambiguity in film. And I don't like
ambiguous endings.
Yeah, I don't like endings like that, but I think that sometimes, depending on the story that you're trying to tell, we as the audience don't need every single answer to every single question.
Oh, and I mean, for something like this, like, what possible answer could there be, right? Like,
that would be satisfying. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, if it's like, oh, his ex-girlfriend put a hex on him, it's like, are you fucking kidding me? Like, that's the problem I have with Stephen King sometimes, is that sometimes his explanations for things, I was like, I would almost rather you just neglected an explanation, Steve, because that was pretty dumb.
Well, that would have made I think that would have made the film feel a little bit more like an SNL bit, right?
Yeah, basically, right?
Like a Blues Brothers, Carrie Fisher kind of idea.
A bunch of silly buggers, yeah.
Anyway, like, so then he wrote the original script and kind of shopped it around for a while.
As you do.
Yeah, as you are aware of. And eventually Harold Ramis got a hold of it and picked it up. And I think he had really mixed feelings on it initially. Like, it was something that he wanted to produce and ended up directing, but it actually went through a lot of rewriting and even more rewriting on the rewriting over time.
I think I remember, what's his face? The guy who plays Ned Ryerson said that when he showed up for his first day of shooting, they handed him a brand new script, which was probably like 2/3 new material.
Yeah, well, and even like the final Ned Ryerson scene was just kind of tacked on at the end of filming.
They were just like, oh, here you go. Yeah.
They were like, oh, you know what? We could actually use one more Ned Ryerson scene. I actually really liked that scene. That was my favorite Ned Ryerson scene. And I actually think that it retcons some of my problems with the earlier scenes a little bit. But, it that goes to showing some of, the chaos of the script and the revisions through time. And that's the reality of all films. Like, if you...
Hey, that's the reality of the creative process, baby. It's a fucking mess.
Yeah, like, I mean, yeah. I just watched, like, The Shining the other day in theater, which was an awesome experience, but I went home and immediately was like, I need to read everything about this movie because it was so great. And that is, again, something that happened and occurred on set of that, is that every day they were getting new revisions to the script. And it's not as extreme as something like The Shining, but in this case, like with this film, I think the writing process is so fascinating to dive into here.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, even like there are rumors that, like, major studio movies today sometimes start shooting without a completed script and they just kind of wing it.
Right. And you can see, I think, some of the, like, most famous stories, like the new Star Wars trilogy, right? Like, not having a cohesive idea.
Yeah, that's a situation where it really didn't work.
Yeah, exactly. But that's also, trying to tell a cohesive story through a series where, again, I think that's also part of the time too, right? Like, when you and I are watching TV, for example, in 2024, we have the golden era of television of the last 10 to 15 years to choose from. And the best of that era tells a cohesive story from start to finish. And while there might not be like, we're starting here, we know how to get to point A, B, C, D, all the way to Z. They know point A, they know point Z often, and they can figure it out in between and make a cohesive story that makes sense, right?
Oh, I've often said that, like, it's, even with my own writing process, it's like, you got to know where you're starting and you got to know where you're ending. Like, you can flounder around in the middle, but you got to know where you're going.
Yeah, and actually that comes back to, in the case of Groundhog Day, I think the ending of Groundhog Day went through a serious revision, entirely for the better, in my opinion. In the original Rubin ending, Rita actually ends up trapped in her own time loop.
Yeah.
And that's how it ends, right?
Yeah, Jesus. That would have been a very jarring ending.
Yeah. Like, it wouldn't provide any sort of satisfaction, really, right? Like, the only part that I guess I could say silver lining to that would be that, you know, she has somebody like Phil who understands and can be very quickly explained to, I am stuck in this now and I'm experiencing this. But that would have completely ruined the entire movie for me.
Oh,
I think.
yeah, and I mean, maybe there was in that original draft, it made more sense, but I mean,
Yeah.
bleh.
Yeah, and stuff like that, like Harold Ramis was really interested in this as a comedy, but he on first read did not think that the script was funny at all. And obviously somebody like Harold Ramis and even Bill Murray would be credited with all of the funnier moments of the film. And a lot of it, like, there were moments of Bill Murray just ad-libbing quotes, right?
Oh yeah, for sure.
The wherever you're headed, could you call in sick?
Yeah. That was all Bill Murray.
Yeah, exactly, right? But the original script is significantly more interested in the spiritual ideas of what the film takes on. You know, there's an interesting tightrope there to walk, and everybody's going to have their preference. Like I've already kind of said, I prefer the more spiritual ideas and concepts of the film than I do the comedy. But with this film, and part of the reason why I think this film is held up so well is that, you know, you can take whatever you want out of this, right? Like you can enjoy it just for the comedy that it is, or you can enjoy it for the bigger ideas that it has.
You know, for me, I think this movie strikes the perfect balance because, like, generally my philosophy is when I open a book or turn on a movie or watch a show, fundamentally, I want to be entertained, right?
Yeah.
If there's some deeper themes or deeper messages, that's great. But I think as a consumer and as an artist myself, your first goal needs to be to entertain.
I absolutely agree with that idea. And that's, you know, on the side, you and I have talked about my ambitions to edit some films and some film series at some point. And like we've even talked recently about my rewatch of the Peter Jackson Hobbit trilogy. And, you know, we talked about what I would want to do to that. And Jess said while we were in that conversation, like, oh, you probably would need to reread the book actually to tell the story in its original intention. And I actually pushed back on that and said, no, like I actually care more about making the Hobbit trilogy into like a pure piece of film entertainment. And I think that trying to directly apply the source material there, it's already been done before. You can find film fan edits that make the Hobbit series true to that series. But B, as somebody who really loves film and is very interested in it, like, and this is like basically, you know, one of my only versions of art that I really would be able to talk on.
Yeah.
The entertainment aspect is, like you said, front and foremost for me.
Yeah, no, and I mean, you know, a lot of intellectuals will be rolling their eyes at us right now, but like, it's not easy to entertain, you know?
No.
Like, it's complicated, you know? And then, like, don't look down on entertainment because, like, it's hard to entertain an audience.
And even, like, the people who are in charge, the people that you would consider to be experts on the subject, I think you've said this before, like, have no idea what actually is going to entertain or not.
Yeah, and that's the famous William Goldman quote is nobody knows anything in all caps. Like,
right.
You know, we have no idea what's going to stick and what's not. So, like...
Yeah, so just in a sense, do create the art that you want to create, but never forget the audience that's going to be consuming it, I guess is the lesson here.
I guess so. It reminds me of in Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, Jerry Seinfeld talks about the idea of like sitcoms that fail, and it's like, here we've spent millions of dollars on this sitcom and we're broadcasting it for free to your living room, and people just being like, we don't want it.
Yeah. In speaking to all of this, like, it goes through its first draft, it goes through its rewrites with Harold Ramis and Danny Rubin working together to rewrite, and then it even, to a degree, goes through a rewrite with Bill Murray getting involved with the film.
The Hurricane, yeah.
Because he, at this point in time, part of it's like external factors, he's going through a divorce at this time, but he's also kind of a little bit more interested in the long-term idea for, I think, his career as an artist. Mm-hmm. And he's certainly more interested with the contemplative aspects of the movie rather than the comedy. And that's actually where Harold Ramis and Bill Murray really butted heads on this, right? Throughout filming.
Yeah, I think Danny Rubin explicitly compared them to like brothers who weren't getting along.
Yeah, at one point in time, Harold Ramis actually just basically pawned Murray off to Danny Rubin and didn't really want to discuss changes to the plot or scenes with Bill Murray. There's other quotes from on set of the film where Harold Ramis would kind of try to explain scenes to Bill Murray, and he would just ask, like, do you want good Phil or bad Phil and stuff like that, right? Like,
Jesus.
They really struggled to kind of see eye to eye with the film and what they were making.
Well,
and that's partially like just the dumb luck of them perfectly balancing between the comedy and the contemplative, right?
I guess so. Yeah. I mean, I do find it kind of tragic that like Bill Murray was so unhappy with the experience that he didn't speak to Harold Ramis for years after this movie.
Well, yeah, that's a whole different story.
That's the Hurricane, yeah.
Yeah, right? And there's some other like really famous comedic duos who also have similar experiences where it's like when they do come together, it's lightning in a bottle, but they're just such large personalities that it's hard to work together when you have like, you know, two people who I would consider absolute masters of their craft.
Yeah, I mean, that is kind of a Clash of the Titans kind of situation. And I mean,
yeah.
You're right, it worked out in this case. It's just kind of tragic that it led to some hurt feelings. Although I guess they reconciled before Harold Ramis's death, so, you know, whatever.
And that, you know what, there's even like an aspect of that of like working with friends and family too, right?
Yeah,
like,
yeah, exactly. Don't mix business with pleasure.
Yeah, exactly. And like that's bound to cause issues, like, and you're not always going to work well with everybody, but so you can both be extremely talented and also completely clash on
disagree
projects.
Yeah,
which you and I sometimes do during the podcast here, but
we have the mildest disagreements.
yeah, but you and I have a part of it's because we've talked about movies and culture for our literal entire lives. Like, it's something that you and I know how to navigate these conversations really well, even if we're not seeing eye to eye on stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, as soon as we stop recording, we just scream at each other, just for those for those
we
not
don't
in the
speak
know.
to each other outside of the podcast.
Yeah,
actually.
Exactly. We have a mediary who navigates between us during after recording.
I couldn't even imagine, like, and that happens in art, really.
Oh yeah, for sure. You know what I mean?
It's wild. Yeah, I guess the only other piece of effects and filming that I really wanted to mention was the scene where Phil breaks the pencil to see if it'll regenerate. He leaves it beside his bed. The original scene that they shot for it was of Phil destroying the entire room, like spray painting walls, like just smashing everything. He shaves his head in the scene. And then they were trying for a shot of like all of this happening, and then they were gonna pan out after he shaves his head and his hair just like appears again and everything behind him just immediately fixes. And in 1993 they didn't quite have the VFX to pull that off.
No, that also just sounds like a lot. You know what I mean? The whole pencil thing is very effective and it's very understated.
Yeah. And actually, this is my only spot where I could shoehorn this in. I love this scene where Phil is breaking the clock over and over again.
Yeah.
And I love the camera shot of the close-up of the clock and the numbers like slowly tick down to 6 a.m. That's just like one of those little details that really popped for me.
Yeah, for sure.
I want to talk score really briefly, and the thing that I actually want to talk about the most for the score is the use of the song I Got You, Babe.
Right. My favorite is when he finally breaks the time loop and the radio DJs accidentally play it again. And the one DJ's like, come on, man, that song's awful.
Well, it's funny because I Got You, Babe was written by Sonny and Cher back in 1965, And when I
Oh,
say Cher in 1965, I literally mean like that Cher.
in
She has been making music for
1965.
that long. Yeah.
Jesus
Which is
Christ.
wild. So it was originally her and her husband at the time's band that they had together. And I gotta say, like, it's a really great song. It's a really great song choice because it's annoyingly catchy, right? And repetitive.
Okay, yeah.
It's something that, for me personally, it's been stuck in my head for the last week or so since watching the movie. Every time I think of this movie, eventually, within a minute or two of thinking about it, the melody of the song really starts to play over and over in my head.
Okay, I have not gone completely insane that same way, but okay, interesting.
For me, I just think that it was a really great song choice, and I think that, people who care have more weighting on the score and the mix probably than you
Yeah, sorry,
are going to
bro.
pick up on that. But that's okay. You care more about story than I care about story often, so we have to all have our likes and what we care about, what hills we're willing to die on.
That's our Bill Murray Harold Ramis partnership right now.
Yeah, exactly. Although that's complimentary in a sense, though, because I could like really appreciate the score and pick up on the score, and you would pick up on the plot and like the intricate details of the plot, right?
Well, Bill Murray and Harold Ramis's relationship was complimentary too. They just hated each other.
Yeah, fair enough. Otherwise, like the rest of the score is a pretty like standard 90s score. I didn't really think about it too hard while I was watching it. I don't really have a whole lot of feedback on it. Like it's probably one of the weaker elements of the film that, didn't pop in this one for me.
No, I mean, I didn't notice, but like I often don't notice the score, so I can't really weigh it.
Yeah, fair enough. I do want to do a quick look back at the times. This came out in 1993, and if you actually go back and look at the 1993 year as a movie year, I think this is maybe one of the top 10 best years in film ever. So let me just quickly give you the list of movies that also came out in 1993. Jurassic Park, highest grossing film of all time the year it came out.
Might have heard of it.
Yeah. Mrs. Doubtfire and Indecent Proposal, Wayne's World, all the comedies that this one would have been competing with. Free Willy came out then. Schindler's List in Philadelphia.
Oh
Dazed and
my.
Confused. Batman, Mask of the Phantasm, and The Nightmare
Yay.
Before Christmas.
Wow.
It's wild that this movie actually has stood up to the test of time because there's a lot of other movies in that year which often are cited as some of the greatest movies of all time for their genre or film style or whatever, right?
Yeah, I mean, this was a tough year. Oh, Nightmare Before Christmas also came out that year.
Yeah. That was the last one I said. Like, so,
Oh.
of those movies that I listed, I've watched almost half of them within the last 5 years, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Personally. At the time, though, this movie was actually somewhat misunderstood by critics. Like, everybody kind of had a bone to pick with something or other with the film. Like, very, very differing opinions on this one. Really, the only thing that everybody immediately loved was Bill Murray and Andy McDowell's performances in the
Oh
film.
yeah, I mean that's front and center, right?
Yeah, that's the universal thing that everybody did enjoy, but there were people who didn't like the comedy elements. They didn't like the philosophical elements. They thought, they focused on a little too much of this, a little too much of that. Like, there were so many different aspects of the movie that people weren't in love with. And part of it, again, was like, well, we didn't get an explanation of what the time loop is and stuff like that. But in terms of the legacy of this film, like, that's something that I think has been, significantly reevaluated over time. And that's one of the cool things about art is that it can be reevaluated over time, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
We talked about this in the primer. Like, I consider this a must-watch film at some point in your life. It's one of the classic comedies. It's the time loop movie and time loop piece of culture that has spawned a whole subgenre, as you put it.
Mm-hmm.
It also, this is the reason why Bill Murray gets more depth in roles after this. Like, his Wes Anderson relationship and all of the films they've done together.
Very, very productive relationship with Wes Anderson.
that might not have come around without a film like this. And same thing with Sofia Coppola and Lost in Translation. It's interesting to see how this film fits into somebody's legacy.
Yeah, absolutely.
It also, had a pretty big impact on the town of Punxsutawney itself. Like, we were talking about how we weren't sure how nationally how this affected Groundhog Day and people's interest in Groundhog Day, but at a smaller level, at the Punxsutawney level, in 1994, 35,000 people showed up to Punxsutawney for Groundhog Day.
Yeah. Wow. Holy shit.
Yeah. The town of Woodstock, Illinois, where they actually filmed Groundhog Day, there's plaques of all the key locations. You can really make a vacation out of going and like visiting the set of this film because it's a live setting.
Interesting.
Even the famous pothole is actually still there.
No one has ever filled it in. That's really funny.
William Goldman in 1993 said that this would be the movie of 1993 that would be remembered in 10 years, which, as I just explained with all of the movies that came out that year, like, he's not necessarily wrong. Like, this is one of the most culturally impactful movies of that decade even.
Hey, it's been 31 years and we're talking about it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's our job on this, is to bring you movies that we think you might be interested in, but
even still,
I guess that speaks to, yeah.
I like how you tried to downplay my point, but then you just talked yourself back into it.
Yeah. Sometimes you need to full circle yourself.
It happens.
But yeah, no, the other, like, so we've talked about Palm Springs, we've talked about Edge of Tomorrow, the games like Deathloop and Outer Wilds, the like share connections to this. Like, a lot of this stuff doesn't get made without something like this. Russian Doll is the Netflix TV show that came out within the last 5 years that really plays with this concept over a TV series. 50 First Dates probably doesn't get made without this movie. Even like the movie Yesterday, which I really enjoyed when it came out, the Danny Boyle kind of what if comedy, what if everybody forgot that the Beatles existed except for one person. Right. Stuff like that, like, really nods to something like this, and not only, I guess, making fantasy mainstream in a sense, but also like making the audience more intelligent and being able to conceptualize and be more willing to accept, like, these fantasy type of elements. But like, the other component of this is like movies that don't even share like the time loop idea, but share more fantasy elements to them, do become more mainstream after this. And, we play with the idea of this. And a few of the examples that I had found online and nods to this movie were like, I mean, two of them are Jim Carrey movies, Liar, Liar, and The Truman Show, right? Like, something that is surreal that would never happen in real life, I mean, that you or I are aware of, that the audience can accept relatively quickly because of a movie like this.
I guess this movie was one of the first like fantasy comedies of the 90s.
Well, and fantasy and fantasy in the sense of like true surreal otherworldly kind of elements to them, right? Like, we had fantasy comedies in a sense with like Robin Hood Men in Tights or something like that, right? But there's a parodiness to that, whereas this is kind of doing its own original thing. It's almost like high fantasy comedy.
Yeah, kinda.
That's all my thoughts on that stuff. Personal reviews in the partner factor. You and I have probably more than usual kind of talked about where we sit with this film, but I don't know, maybe you want to start with your summarized thoughts on this one and what your girlfriend thought of it as well.
Well, my girlfriend wouldn't watch it with me, so it's just me today, but I really enjoyed this movie quite a lot. Like, honestly, it's probably in my top 10, top 20.
Yeah.
So it's one of the few movies where I don't really have anything to complain about. And you know me, I love complaining. So this is a real sticky situation for me.
And again, we've kind of talked about this in the primer episode. I would probably put this in my top 40, top 50 somewhere, because I think it's a classic. I think it's a must-watch film at some point in your life that everybody can connect to on some level to some degree. But I think that in 2024, the first 40 minutes to an hour don't quite hold up, and that's, again, partially because of the success of a film like this and the ideas just becoming universal concepts that people understand and can conceptualize that in a way slightly hurt the film.
I don't think I agree, but I see your point. I think this movie stands up pretty well.
Yeah, and that's something that Jess and I both share. And again, it's not to say that I don't love this movie, because I'm saying that this is my top 30, top 40, but I can recognize, and especially because of framing this in the sense of what this podcast is and what we're trying to do on this, that it doesn't necessarily always stand the test of time because of its success in the culture.
Okay.
Which is a weird place to be in, right? But
imagine being so successful you've actually crossed infinity and become a little less successful.
I mean, at the end of the day, though, I can knock the first part of this movie down a point, but the last half of this film is so good. And like I said, at the point in time where Phil's playing the piano, and then everybody starts bidding for him, and like there's this general excitement in the crowd of like, this person is larger than life, and everybody wants to be in his life and be a part of his life. Like I got a little emotional at that. I was like, like it really turns things around for me.
We should all be so lucky, right? Yeah. That's what
and like and it shows as well, right? That like you can live in your own pleasures for as long as you want. You can like focus on yourself and everything. But at the end of the day, part of your legacy is what you've shared of yourself with those around you, right?
Yeah, and that's, you know what? That's a pretty compelling message.
Yeah.
Hey, it's true. Like, I think this is the kind of movie, too, that gets better as you get older.
I agree.
It's
I
a
very much agree.
mature movie in some sense.
Yeah, I mean, like, I still enjoyed it as a teenager. I probably watched this movie in my early teens, like probably 10 years old or so when I first watched this, and I really liked it back then. But yeah, once you've lived life, I think, a little bit, and experienced life, I think you start to understand Phil a little bit more.
Yeah, and you start to understand what's really important more and more. At least, hopefully, if you're doing things right. You know, this would be a good litmus test. Like, show this movie to a 40-year-old man who's never seen it, and if he doesn't like it, then we shoot him into the sun. I don't know. This metaphor kind of ran away from me.
You got to workshop that one a little bit. But yeah, no, and Jess kind of sits in the exact same spot as me. She has the exact same thoughts on this one as me. We were very much on the same page after this one, and our discussion was very, very similar opinion on this one, which her and I don't always share on a lot of movies. So
no, I was going to say, like, first time for everything. You guys agreed on a movie.
Yeah, I think that's it for everything I want to talk about with the movie. Great movie. I recommend it. Like I've said in the primer episode, this is a movie for literally everyone to experience at least once in their life.
Yeah, no, I have nothing but good things to say about this movie too. I'm grateful we did it. Like, it gave me an excuse to rewatch it.
Yeah, for sure. And then upcoming, we've got True Romance, which is our first Quentin Tarantino movie that we're doing on the podcast, even though it's, not a Quentin Tarantino directed movie.
It's not a pure Tarantino experience.
No, but I think it's really cool that we're getting to experience him in this way, because I think that's going to add something to the conversation about the film itself, right? Have you seen True Romance before?
No, I haven't.
It's a very interesting film, and I don't know if you're going to have capacity to check it out before Jason and I do the episode or not, or even if you'd want to join us, but I think it's very fascinating, and I'm really looking forward to rewatching it and discussing it, because this will be only my second time actually seeing this movie. The first time Jess and I checked it out last year. And then upcoming, we've got our Oscars series. We're doing 2 movies from a past Oscars that were both nominated, and one of them won the Oscar for Best Picture of that year. I did my research. I found a similar year that we can compare to this year, with like a movie like Oppenheimer being, the big obvious choice for a lot of awards, but as well something like another biographical type of film based on a novel in Killers of the Flower Moon. I found the closest comparison to this year, and that means we're doing Lawrence of Arabia and we're doing To Kill a Mockingbird, both of which I'm really excited to watch. I've only ever seen To Kill a Mockingbird once in high school, and Lawrence of Arabia has been something that Jason and I have been talking about since we started this podcast.
I haven't seen either, so I'm excited to jump on board with those.
Yeah, for sure. So stay tuned for all of that. We've got a lot of exciting stuff coming, and there might even be a Roadhouse episode coming up at some point soon.
Okay. First I'm hearing of this, but okay.
Yeah, it's something that Jason and I have been talking about back and forth. It's in our group chat that you never read, so.
Yeah, that's fair.
But anyway, that's it for Groundhog Day. I hope everybody had fun because it's cold outside.
Bring your booties.
And we'll see you next time. Tell your dad.
Tell your dad.